If you care about stories of dignity and justice, stay with this one, and please consider subscribing and liking. It matters. The bell over the bakery door jingled with an ordinary cheer that morning, and the smell of yeast and butter folded into the street like an invitation. Mariana stood just inside the glass, a small hand on the strap of her daughter's coat. Sophia's face was nearly hidden beneath a ribboned hat, eyes wide and quick like a bird's. Mariana's voice had the careful softness of someone who had learned to make less of herself. "Please, is there any cake that's gone off today? I promised her." Ricardo was behind the counter, palms in flour, sleeves rolled, the kind of man who kept a permanent crease of amusement at the corner of his mouth. He moved as if the room belonged to him, and perhaps at that hour it did. Regulars came, coins changed hands, the hum of small everyday commerce allowed a manager to feel more than he was. He looked at Mariana, and the look fell into a laugh that did not quite reach his eyes. "Expired?" he said, louder than necessary. "We don't give away expired cake. We sell good cake here. What is this, some charity hour?" A few customers turned. Cynthia, who was stacking baguettes at the next counter, flinched and dropped a crisp that cracked like a small gunshot in the quiet. She'd watched these interludes for months. Flustered people who avoided eye contact, hungry hands that lingered near the pastries and then pulled back when the manager sighed. She had rarely spoken up. Patrons complained if the service slowed. The bakery needed rhythm and discipline. She had learned to keep her mouth small. Mariana's fingers tightened on Sophia's sleeve. Sophia's chin sank toward her chest. "It's her birthday," Mariana said, voice small but steady. "She is 5. I could buy her bread, but I promised. She wanted cake. If you have any that won't sell—" Ricardo's laugh filled the space between them like spilled oil. "You expect me to give a cake to the lady who sleeps under the bridge? That's rich." The word bridge hit soft and public, like a stone thrown into still water. Some heads turned an inch further. The bread seller at the corner cleared his throat. A man in a suit, coffee in hand, narrowed his eyes and looked away. Sophia's fingers curled into Mariana's skirt. The hat slipped a little, a dark curl fell on the small forehead. The child kept talking to herself in the language of 5 years old, a whispering hum about candles and wishes, a rhythm Mariana used to keep the edges of fear at bay. Mariana swallowed. There were 1,000 strategies for survival, and none that included being the center of a spectacle. From across the street, a boy watched. He was smaller than Sophia, face smudged with the kind of soot that comes from sleeping near drains and trains, knees patched, eyes a sharp, hungry amber. He shoved a cracked toy car between his legs and asked nothing. Ricardo pushed the counter and stepped toward Mariana as if to finish the humiliation. "Lady, either buy something or leave. We don't give charity. We survive." He said survive as if the bakery were a nervous organism, and anyone who asked for help was a predator. It should have been the end of it. Someone always left embarrassed. Someone else always pretended not to see. But Artur had not come that morning simply for pastry. The world had arranged him a role, spectator, accumulator, and he could choose to act differently. He stood up then, his movement quiet but authoritative. He walked to the door and without elaborate entrance crossed the small space between the counter and Mariana. He stood behind her like a hand that could, if it wanted, press down. "Is something wrong?"
he asked, and his voice was calm enough to be a small remedy to the rawness in the air. Ricardo turned. He recognized the man. People like him were often recognized by the way they wore their clothes and carried their coffee. But he had missed the name attached to the face. "No, sir, everything is fine," he said, too fast. "This is a—" Artur looked at him. There was no need to say he was the owner. It can be a careless assumption that wealth alone grants remedy. He didn't say it. He watched Mariana instead. He looked at Sofia and remembered the candled table from his childhood, at a distance, and he felt something like a question. What responsibility does sight impose on those who see? Mariana was suspicious. She had learned to be. A hand crossing the threshold of privacy could feel like parlor trickery. The generous stranger who expects gratitude and offer of future service. She looked at Artur's coat, at the quiet eyes, and met him with the kind of brief evaluation that had kept her and Sofia alive. "No, sir," she said carefully. "We were just leaving. Thank you." Artur's gaze softened on Sofia. "Happy birthday," he said simply, and handed her a small paper bag with a warm, soft loaf he had asked them to pack at the back counter. It was not cake, but it was bread and warmth in a man's hand. For a moment, Sofia's face lit like a match. The boy across the street watched this exchange, and, without understanding class or charity in neat terms, took it as a promise that small miracles might happen anywhere. Ricardo's nostril flared. "You can buy anything here," he said to Mariana with a collared, venomous generosity. That was the unbearable line he used, the moralizing jab that made a person fold. Mariana bowed a little and stepped outside, shifting Sofia's weight on her hip. The boy followed for a few paces, shyly close, as if he might learn how to move in a world where men like Artur occasionally open doors. Artur did not follow them. He watched them leave and then sat back down with his coffee. But the image folded into him like a cold coin.
Giuliano found that Mariana had a name on her ID, a record of work years before, a few addresses, and a last registered household with an address linked to a man, Rodrigo, whose name carried small flags, missing court dates, a restraining order requested and then dropped, a clerk's note about heated disputes. There were the quiet annotations of people failing to complete the system's steps because it was too expensive to navigate legal forms. Artur thought of the boy's question about the monkey. It was, in its bluntness, an innocent request to see the life of someone who had more, but it was also an invitation for him to see what his money's shape had done to people nearby. The coin in his pocket had more power than his polite distance allowed. He felt, abruptly, the responsibility that came with waking up into a city where the hungry could scrape by in the places most people walked through without looking. He made a plan that would not be a rescue in the theatrical sense. He wanted processes, a lawyer to file correct paper, a safe apartment to sign a lease, a job training course offered with respect, not pity, and a place at the bakery where dignity could be rebuilt by work, not charity. He knew he could open a door. He also knew he must let the person pass through it. Giuliano arranged a discreet meeting. He spoke with Cynthia and asked about the unsold goods. He discovered, in 3 minutes of quiet conversation in a back room full of flour dust, that the bakery threw away a surprising amount of unsold bread and pastries each day because of shifting tastes and presentation. Cynthia said nothing extravagant. She only shrugged. "We used to do a little for the shelter, but the manager liked the shelves to look full." Her voice was small.
"We used to put leftovers in boxes and—" She stopped, as if what she had learned to do was now forbidden. Arthur watched, listened. He had an impulse to do more than give bread. He wanted to change the policy, to create a system so people would not have to ask at the counter with their hands out. He wanted to stop the humiliation. He did not fantasize about being a savior. The plan was pragmatic and indexed to consent. Food distribution without spectacle, training programs, and legal assistance. He drafted a proposal that afternoon with Giuliano and a lawyer who owed him a favor. He left the files on his desk, and then, like a man making a promise to himself, he called Mariana. He found her outside the municipal office, where forms were filed and numbers given. She had been there before and had learned to read the way lists read, with suspicion. She agreed to meet in a coffee shop where they could speak freely. She wore a coat with the kind of thinning at the cuffs that only long, careful mending could hide. Arthur had never felt so ill at ease than sitting across from someone who had to measure every word. He started slow.
Guia de estilo e instruções para a síntese de fala. Você é narrador, palestrante, com voz potente, forte e autoritária. O tom deve ser firme e inabalável. Contexto de continuidade. A frase anterior era: She did so with small, practical questions. Who would come if Rodrigo showed up? What would happen if her ID was needed? Whether Sofia could attend the local public school and have a uniform? Each time Arthur answered, he did so with a specificity that showed he had someone working for him who knew municipal processes. He did not shower her with platitudes. He provided action items. 2 weeks later, a modest apartment keys changed hands. Giuliano had found a 1-bedroom unit above a small florist's shop, cheap by the city standards, but real. No cardboard, no leaky ceiling, a window that framed a maple tree where light came in soft. There was a small stove and a tub that filled almost instantly with hot water. Sofia learned to run her finger along the edge of the sink and say, with the kind of reverence children afford new things, "It's a real window." They unpacked slowly, a crate at a time. Mariana folded the only blanket they had so many times that the edges felt stronger. The loaf Arthur had first given them became an offering between neighbors when they shared one with the boy Chico, who arrived with a handful of marbles in his palm, shy and ecstatic to be invited into an apartment that smelled of soap. Arthur didn't stay long in the first weeks. He set the machinery into motion. The protective order process began with a lawyer serving notice. The bakery began a soft experiment of setting aside unsold goods in unmarked paper bags for a community pickup administered through an anonymous contact number. Cynthia changed her shift patterns and began training under new guidelines that emphasized dignity. No calling out recipients by their need, no staged distributions. The manager, Ricardo, bristled at the changes. There were quiet fights, and the staff muttered about orders from above with the thin irritation of those who resent being told to be humane. But the policy stuck because it came with funding and because Arthur refused to make a spectacle of it. The legal steps were unromantic but effective. There were documents to fill out, a line at the courthouse where a clerk asked for precise times and dates, a statement to sign that would be a weighty text if Rodrigo ever tried to cross a boundary. Mariana sat in a small office with a window and watched the rain batter against glass. The lawyer, a woman with practical glasses and a calmness honed by many similar cases, explained the protective order in plain language. It meant Rodrigo could not approach within a certain radius, that the police had legal grounds to arrest him if he violated the terms.
It did not erase fear, but it introduced a buffer. The job training at the bakery was not romantic either. It smelled of flour and late mornings. It required patience for the routine, for repetitions, for tasks that seemed small but built competence. Mariana learned to fold pastry dough, to read orders, to measure sugar accurately.
She discovered a competence for the small orders that steadied her, piping cream without shaking, learning the names of pastries with a quick, proud repetition. At first, Ricardo gave her the worst shifts, placing her in corners or in the back where customers looked less. He muttered about standards. But Cynthia made sure Mariana got real hours and that the schedule did not include the closing shifts when things could get unpredictable. The pay was steady, and when Sophia came to help fold napkins, the bakery smelled less like a place of humiliation and more like the possibility of an ordinary life. Word spreads in neighborhoods the way rain does, small and inevitable. Cynthia, who had watched the man with patience and an eye for quiet things, became more decisive. She started to insist the staff treat people equally. She trained them to prepare a bag labeled simply "Community" and to place it behind the counter on a low shelf at closing, with no looking or asking at the recipients. She coordinated with a local drop-in center so that distribution would be steady and not public. When Ricardo spat his final complaint publicly in front of customers, Arthur was not in the bakery to answer with some dramatic revelation. He preferred mechanisms. He sent a human resources consultant and made the change in staff. Ricardo was dismissed for behavior that destabilized the staff. He left with a few muttered threats and a small indignant fury that would be dealt with by the market or his own choices. The boy Chico would sometimes show up at the bakery window and press his nose against the glass as Sophia did, delighted whenever someone waved. Once, when a passerby asked him what he wanted, he said solemnly, "To see the Millionaire'S monkey." People laughed until they remembered it was not a punchline, but a child's honest question. The monkey, if it ever existed, had become a talisman of wanting, rather than of envy. It signaled a hunger to see beyond one's own small life. Arthur found himself drawn into the everyday rituals of being useful without spectacle. He arranged a small fund for Cynthia to run a dignity-based program, refrigerated boxes for unsold perishable items, trained staff to handle distributions, and a quiet sign-up sheet for anyone who needed a small voucher, no questions asked. He asked Giuliano to manage confidentiality, no lists, no broadcast. He visited once in a blue-sky mood and sat in the corner, listening to the rhythm of the place, a man learning again how ordinary life smelled. Yeast, coffee, the faint perfume from the florist below his new tenants. He watched Mariana work with a new steadiness. She had learned how to hold Sophia and balance orders. There was a quickness to her hands that came from necessity and a gentleness that came from deliberate choice. When she laughed in the back room with Cynthia, it was a small, surprising sound. They made plans for Sophia's school uniform and for a cake that would be baked in a tiny oven under the apartment's window, not fancy, but real. The neighborhood shifted, little by little, around acts that were neither headline nor charity glare. It changed by giving people the option to be citizens of a place where choices mattered. The boy who had asked to see the Millionaire'S monkey came by often, and sometimes Artur would give a stack of cookies to the children without making much. He taught himself to avoid the words that make gestures into headlines. I helped them. Instead, he found the quiet joy of seeing someone take a key and open a door. There remained practical complications, small legal snags, the slow bureaucracy of housing policy, Rodrigo's occasional threats at a distance.
The police had been given the protective order paper. They had a file. Mariana slept differently. Fear receded into a lighter companion. It was still there in the small flinches when someone banged on glass or when a car slowed suspiciously. But there was also a layer of planning, neighbor's number written on a small card, a phone with credit for emergencies, a designated friend who could watch Sophia for a few hours when necessary. Artur did not expect affection to follow. He had not bought his way into anyone's gratitude. He had been careful to place obligations in legal language and not in emotional currency. What he had not predicted, what no spreadsheet could model, was how the presence of the boy who asked about the monkey would sharpen the neighborhood's sense of what dignity meant. The question had been a tiny clarion. To be allowed to look was a courtesy humans owed one another. One evening, a cluster of the bakery's regulars gathered in the park below the apartment building. There was a small table where someone had arranged leftover pastries and tea. Children chased one another. The maple tree's new leaves whispered in the light. Sophia sat on an old blanket and drew pictures for all the visitors. Mariana watched her, hand warm on Sophia's head, and let herself absorb the fact of ordinary protection: a lock on a door, a stove that heated water, a job that paid more than the city's rumor of scraps. She had a small list of things to do: enroll Sophia, fill out employment forms, attend a counseling session, but the long, dangerous nights were fewer. Artur was there too, sitting on a bench with Giuliano beside him. He had learned to talk less about purpose and more about the silent satisfaction of doing a thing right. The boy Chico approached and held out a drawing of a monkey, crude and sunny, a large smile on its face. "For you," he said, solemn as confession. Artur took the paper and smiled, small and private. "It's very good." He tucked the drawing into his jacket, a tiny artifact of a life he had decided not to keep at a distance. Later, when he walked back to his car, a neighbor asked him plainly, "Why help them, Artur?"
It was not a question about money, everyone knew he had enough, but a question about motive. He hesitated the tiniest moment and then said, "Because seeing is not the same as doing nothing." He did not explain his grief. He did not have to. The way he set meals into a system was enough. Yet there was another problem that needed correction. Ricardo's dismissal had been swift, initiated by Cynthia's quiet courage and Artur's funds. But the public humiliation remained an emotional scar for Mariana. She had been visible then, the object of derision, and while action had followed, the memory of being made less would not dissolve quickly. She still flinched in crowded spaces and sometimes avoided bank windows where someone's eyes might linger. The shape of dignity was not only a roof and a contract, it was the slow accumulation of people treating you as if your choices mattered. When Artur proposed, quietly, with no grand speech, to host a modest event in the bakery to welcome those in the program and to launch the non-stigmatizing distribution system, Mariana bristled. "I don't want a ceremony," she said. "I want to work, to pay, and to be left in peace." "That's exactly it," Artur said. "We'll make it a working breakfast. People who come will be staff, neighbors, and friends. You and Cynthia can design it. No one will be put on show." She considered that, and, with the kind of small resolution that had always kept her afloat, agreed to help. The morning of the working breakfast, the bakery hummed differently. There were volunteers who scrubbed counters, people who stacked, and whispers that this was a place where the poor could obtain dignity through labor rather than spectacle.
Chico arrived early and sat at the edge of the counter polishing marbles with a small ceremonial care. Artur moved through the room with the easy patience of a man who had learned to invest in process. He found Ricardo's absence notable and, in private, told Giuliano he still wanted to confront the culture that allowed such humiliations. The confrontation would be public, but not performative. He planned an exposure of policy rather than of its perpetrators. A recorded statement about dignity, the distribution of jobs, and an open invitation to the neighborhood. But he did not want a scene that would reproduce the same hurt. He wanted accountability without spectacle. He wanted the poor boy who had asked about the monkey to be able to ask questions without being laughed at. He wanted the bakery to be a place where bread could be given with paper bags and sealed names, not a corner table where patrons were pointed out. That afternoon, as the new system took its first breaths, someone in the crowd, a delivery man with a phone always half recording, asked out loud, brighter than malice, "Hey, can I at least see the Millionaire's baby monkey?" The question rippled through the room as both joke and genuine curiosity.
For now, there was a modest triumph. A key placed in the hand of a woman who had asked for bread. A job that allowed her to pay a wage and hold her head differently. A child who had learned that wishes could sometimes be met by people who chose to see. The Millionaire's monkey turned out to be nothing more than a question, a youthful myth. But that question, "Can I at least see?" had been the hinge on which small justice turned. The night deepened. Silva, the florist downstairs, left a pot of basil on Mariana's windowsill in a neighborly exchange. A sense of ordinary community settled like dust that refuses to hide the shape of things. Mariana tucked Sophia in, kissed a small forehead that smelled faintly of pastry, and sat for a while at the window, counting the soft lights across the block. She had no illusions about the future. She had only a calendar with appointments and a phone number of a lawyer who would call in the morning to confirm the next step. Outside, the boy Chico clutched the binoculars and looked at the skyline, seeing, as children do, its edges and possibilities. He had asked to see the Millionaire's baby monkey, and, in a way, he had seen everything. The line between indifference and action, the mechanics of practical mercy, and the shape of dignity rebuilt not by charity alone, but by systems that allowed people to accept help without losing themselves. The story stretched forward. The work would continue. The hearings would be scheduled, and a day of public reckoning at the bakery remained on a distant horizon. For now, the small rituals were enough. The cake, the keys, the steady job, the warm bathtub. Mariana breathed, for the first time in a long time, with the quiet confidence of someone who had found a place where being seen no longer meant being diminished. Mariana breathed again, slow and careful, as if relearning how to take in air that did not carry the weight of hunger. Morning found her folding a school uniform at the table, smoothing a crooked collar with fingers that trembled only slightly. Sophia chattered about a drawing she would make for the lady at the bakery, a big cake with 5 candles, and Mariana smiled because the child's world had not yet been taught the shape of adult caution. The lawyer called mid-morning, a measured voice that promised steps and spelled out dates. There would be a preliminary hearing in 2 weeks, a statement to sign, witnesses to be gathered.
The list was short and precise. The bakery cashier, a neighbor who had seen the humiliation, the records of denied service. Mariana listened, repeating a few words, then hung up and sat with the stillness that follows a small verdict. She felt a relief that was at once practical and terrifying. Justice promised bureaucracy and exposure both. She had to decide how much of herself she could afford to display. Artur received the news by text, though the message was careful.
He liked to stand on the sill with the binoculars and look at the distant river, which he insisted held the reason for everything. He listened intently when adult voices spoke of hearings and statements, and, on the day that Artur came with a bundle of printed receipts and a camera to document, he asked simply, "Will they see what they did?" Artur said nothing grand. He handed the boy a biscuit and showed him how a witness could look with attention, not with accusation. "You can tell the truth," Artur said. "You can say, 'I saw.'" The boy nodded, grave beyond his years. Rodrigo's name hovered in Artur's plans like a cautionary note. He had not been present at the bakery during the humiliation, but his alliances and temper made him an unpredictable variable. Artur arranged for discreet surveillance of the edges, calls, places Rodrigo frequented, people who might be moved to protect or threaten. He retained, through channels he kept narrow and quiet, a private investigator who understood the difference between gathering evidence and creating spectacle. Artur did not want to be the man who made enemies for sport. He wanted structural change. He wanted the bakery to be compelled to look at itself and repair its practice, to teach its staff to treat every customer as visible. The neighborhood, sensing that something official was about to occur, reorganized itself into small acts that felt bigger than they were. The woman who ran the bodega put a loaf aside for Mariana each morning. A retired teacher offered to accompany Mariana to the preparatory meeting at the lawyer's office to help her rehearse answers lest nervousness blur the facts. A teenage girl who worked afternoons at the bakery slipped Mariana a note, "I will tell the truth." These things did not erase the fear, they multiplied the courage. On the eve of the first scheduled meeting with the bakery, an informal attempt at mediation before things moved to formal hearing, Artur met Mariana in a small cafe, 2 blocks from her building. She arrived with a tote bag containing the child's favorite pajamas and the signed statements she had managed to gather. Her eyes were lined with fatigue, but there was also a steadiness to them that Artur had not seen the first night he had rescued her from hunger. Here was someone learning to be a citizen within her own life. They spoke of small logistics, of who would speak first, of the tone of the demand. Not shaming, Artur insisted, but accountability. "We want policies changed," he said, "training, a way to report without humiliation, apologies where they are due, compensation for time lost." Mariana listened. When he paused, she said quietly, "And privacy. No cameras in my face." Artur nodded. He had calibrated his plan around that line, honor without exposure. They parted with a plan and a fragile sense of preparedness. Mariana tucked the papers into her bag like rosary beads.
Artur walked away feeling the exactness of timing in his chest, the way a metronome clicks before a symphony begins. He had rehearsed his speech in private rooms, had debated with himself whether to step into the public light at the first hearing, or to remain as the hand that arranged the instruments. He still could not say which choice would best keep those he wanted to protect safe. On the morning of the meeting, the block seemed to hold its breath. The bakery opened its doors without fanfare, ovens clanging, the manager's practiced smile already in place. People passed with ordinary errands, some turning their heads a little more than usual.
Arthur stood at the corner, hands in his pockets, watching a boy press his forehead to the glass to see the trays disappearing into the oven. He thought of the binoculars and of how small tools let people aim their attention. He thought of the key he had entrusted to Mariana, the literal pivot that had become a symbol of trust. A man in a plain suit approached the bakery at the appointed hour. Across the street, neighbors gathered like islands of watching. Arthur stepped forward then, not into the bakery's counterlight, but toward the doorway of a small community room where the meeting would be held. He adjusted the collar of his coat, felt the weight of the printed pages in his bag, and for the first time prepared to be seen on purpose.